Hello again, and welcome to the program. Have you noticed that a lot of people complain about the world of today? There is no peace, and people are fighting each other. And that has been like this for a number of centuries. And humanity has not yet changed. Why is that so? In my understanding, it is not only the world affairs, it is the intelligence that people supposedly possess. Let's go a little further. Perhaps we can examine the situation a little bit more scientifically first. Let us consider a few facts and some theories about the subject of the human brain, and what is and could be the humanity's future in comparison to extraterrestrial intelligence that we hear about these days. Beyond human intelligence. Life itself is a proof or a plain declaration of intelligence. Wherever we find life in the universe, we will inevitably always find intelligence in a stage at some point along its line of development. As life arises from inanimate matter there, as well as in our own world, its processes must inexorably be interwoven into patterns imposed by the nature of the constituent material, the carbon or other compounds, as they proliferate and tend toward greater complexity. This same pattern that weaves itself into the fabric of life is at the same time the pattern that produces and is the structure of intelligence. Now, observing life on Earth from our present vantage point, we see a vast continuum. Life starts small, and in its simplest form, the intelligence it houses, all of which is an expression, is only apparent in the minimal responses of that speck of living matter to such elementary stimuli as light or heat. The single living cell learns, and repetition of a certain experience inclines it to respond more predictably to that experience. In other words, it becomes more intelligent. And as it does so, it influences modifications of the physical body that houses that learning. Over eons, by the simple and automatic process of selection, interactions between the environment and sentient cell foster, in a cyclical fashion, refinement of organs that sense the stimuli, and at the same time, the complexity of the body that responds to them. This complexity of body takes myriad shapes. Any and every form that is possible is at once inevitable. Any assemblage of cells that is viable has its trial in life, and those that have the slightest edge in efficiency survive to continue the onward process toward greater intelligence, while the rest live their span and either die out or persist as living fossils. Way stages on life's journey. Eventually, evolving and continually increasing complexity and assemblage of cells, an organism takes on in response to the stimuli of its environment, reaches the limit of the possibilities offered by that form. Then, like the less successful organisms that preceded it, it too remains with them in stagnation or dies out. When this occurs, we find the progress of intelligence shifted to another line, usually less specialized and more flexible than the earlier highest form. It is as though at these junctures intelligence took several steps backward to find a new base from which to obtain a springboard, to leap forward again to greater advances. When the first amphibians left the seas, for example, more complex, better environmentally adapted creatures, the fishes, remained behind, but life and intelligence had accomplished almost all that was possible within the boundaries of those forms and in that environment. The onward process shifted and became housed in a contemporary, less well-adapted unit of life, but that offered greater possibility for further adjustment, further refinement of responses to more and different stimuli, and more complex bodies and bodily organs, both to receive the more numerous stimuli and to respond to them in more versatile ways. Life's main highway on Earth shifted in turn from the amphibians to the reptiles, which reached the ultimate possibilities open to cold-blooded creatures in the great and vastly long age of the dinosaurs, that period of some 150 million years when life's intelligence was honed through their bodies' responses. When they, in their turn, reached the limits of their form, they sank into stagnation and eventual extinction. Then life and intelligence took off again from a line at that time more backward than theirs, but one that offered a more flexible susceptibility to change, this time via the mammals. We, the supposed humankind, are the current end of the mammalian line in cerebral complexity of the development of intelligence. We may well wonder whether life's still more complex forms and intelligences will proceed from us and our descendants, or whether we constitute another dead end of a line, so that inevitable and implacable further developments and refinements are forced to find a new vessel to promote their onward process. Saying this makes it sound as though life and intelligence were tangible entities that had to accommodate themselves somewhere, whereas, of course, they are qualities. These qualities, in some ways, possess the properties of such a tangible substance as water or stone, which inevitably finds and flows from along the channels that are available to it. This description of qualities like life and intelligence with a substance like water probably arises because, in effect, they are all indeed but expressions of the potentials of life's materials. The present vessel of intelligence's ongoing process, the human brain, being composed of living tissue, can not develop beyond a certain capacity without outstripping the body in which it resides. While the brain governs the body at the same time must nourish the brain. Each is part of a whole, and neither can have independent existence. The simple need for nourishment by a blood supply manufactured in other organs of the body sets the ultimate limits for the brain. Of course, one way to circumvent this limitation would be for bodies to grow larger and larger to accommodate the increasing growth of the brain. A larger body would not only afford it better housing and provision, simultaneously it would provide a greater number of meaningful stimuli to provoke and necessitate its further growth, each part acting on the other and back on itself in life's normal circles of cause and effect. When suggesting this is a possible direction for future evolution, we have to remind ourselves that our knowledge of the way our brains produce thoughts is extremely imperfect development. This is one of the least understood fields of biology. Evidence suggests that an increased mass of brain tissue permits redundancy or dispensation, which is the paramount element in higher intelligence. On the other hand, nature itself shows us that there are ways by which the need for a large individual mass of brain tissue can be circumvented. The social insects are a living demonstration that a sheer number of cooperating tiny brains also gives the necessary redundancy and permits mass actions that appear intelligent. Then again, nature has shown us that an individual creature's evolutionary increases in body size alone does not necessarily involve an equal or equivalent growth in the proportion of that being's brain tissue. The supreme examples of this fact were the dinosaurs. No organ is stimulated to further growth and development unless a need for its enhancement arises that impels natural selection for that further growth. Apparently, the body size of the giant dinosaurs was just sufficient for their survival in their time, and so no selective pressure for further brain development arose among them. It has been hypothesized that among them, indeed, a second brain center evolved in a separate mass along the pathways of the nervous systems of some of their species. Fossil remains indicate that Stegosaurus had a very small cerebral cavity and also a large broadening of the spinal canal in the lumbar region. It is believed that the extremely large bodies of the saurians should not possibly have been supplied effectively by the minuscule brain, and therefore one must assume that a decentralization of nerve tissues must have taken place. It is therefore suggested that since the hypophyseal pouch, an organ of Stegosaurus body, is quite large, it may well have taken over some of the functions of the brain by regulating peripheral organs and perhaps hormonal production. But even if this hypothesis is correct, apparently the modification was either too little or too late to govern adaptively and to keep those mountainous bodies viable. In the end, it did not save them. There is still another alternative to the development of a larger body to provide support and sustenance for a larger brain development of different proportions between them. If evolutionary processes were to select for a head, say 1/5 rather than 1/6 of the body size, then the body, albeit necessarily sturdier, would have some leeway in accommodating a larger brain, since it would have proportionately less of its own tissue to sustain. To some extent, the human beings are both witnesses and exemplars of such a process. Very recently, we have come to understand the mechanism by which it has come about. It is a condition that has been given several names, but which is most frequently referred to as neoteny, since it is an effect in rejuvenation of an evolutionary line arrived at by means of a slowing down of individual development until the adult form of a species eventually comes to retain features that were juvenile and passing phases in ancestral adults. The process is affected by natural selection for rate genes that impose a slower rate of an individual's development. In our own species, we experience a slowing down and prolonging of all the phases of our lives when we compare them with the lives of other primates. A longer intrauterine phase, longer childhood phase, adolescence, and finally a longer adult life and post-mature period that does not occur in other creatures. The effect of the prolongation is to delay and eventually eliminate characteristics that were specializations of the adult forms of our forerunners, and to retain the new adult form that remains comparatively unspecialized and adaptable. This way, human beings no longer develop the hairy pelt, the large teeth, the heavy bones, oblique posture, and many other features of the adult ape, but remain throughout life in what for primates, which includes us, in essentially a juvenile form in our behavior. Too, we retain characteristics that are associated only with the youthful stage of other primates, namely curiosity, exploratory predilections, and ability to learn. A byproduct of this process is the relative proportion of the head and especially the cranium to the total body size. Just as in infants, our own species, the cranium is larger in proportion to the rest of the body than it is in adults. So also in adults of Homo sapiens, the structures housing the brain are in proportion to the body larger than they are in apes, and therefore permit the growth of a more complex brain over the longer period of development available. We have no reason to believe that the course leading to neoteny or the retention of a youthful form should have reached its apogee in us. On the contrary, we must assume it to be an ongoing process. But this process too has its natural limits. The size of the head at birth is eventually limited by the capacity of the body or body structures of the birth canal to accommodate it. And the adaptation of the pelvic structure of the female to accommodate a larger head is limited by the necessities of an ability to walk. This limitation may be, indeed, has been bypassed by the birth of more immature fetuses. But again, immaturity at birth cannot go so far as to revert back to the laying of eggs, or every advantage of mammalian adaptation would be lost. In spite of ultimate limitations, a progression towards greater neoteny would not have to go very far before a new species emerged among our descendants, a totally new kind of being, as different from us, not only in anatomy, but also in intelligence, as we are different from the apes. Our own brain capacity in cubic centimeters, for instance, is not more than double that of the apes. But its growth in intelligence is, as you know, exponential. Although I don't accept the idea of my ancestors being apes. A further increase of our brain size by even a small proportion, implying as it does an increase not only in the number of brain cells but also in the arborization of each cell, and thus its geometrically increased capacities for the complexity of their intercommunication would be sufficient to bring about an intelligence so much greater than our own that it would amount to another dimension. We have named this new species the product of this line of our speculations, Homo neocorticus. But to return from speculation to biological realities, we must keep in mind that the continued growth and development of the brain, like the increased size or spatial development of any other organ, is promoted only out of biological necessities for the survival of an organism in any given environment. When an organ functions perfectly, or a total organism exists in perfect adaptation to its environment, no circumstance can be present that will promote selection for any kind of change. In such conditions, change can only be detrimental, and selection will eliminate it. Further evaluation then occurs only if extraneous circumstances alter the environment so that new development becomes necessary to maintain the adaptation of those creatures that inhabit it. Paradoxically, then, intelligence arises as a result of life's adaptation to environment, but continues to develop only so long as that adaptation is not perfect. Difficulties and even malfunctions, as long as they are not lethal, eventually spur selection for greater intelligence. The interplay between an environment and the behavior of creatures it is mediated by their nervous systems, and it is in this interplay that intelligence is finally honed. The brain itself, of course, cannot do anything. It is a gelatinous mass that needs executive organs, and if its executive organs are inadequate to protect the total creature, either the animal will die out, or, as has happened in some instances, including our own species, brain development stimulates the use of tools. In the latter case, it is inevitable that the tool use itself re-stimulates the brain to further development in a continually reinforcing the cycle. A high degree of individual intelligence displayed in human beings may be seen as an essentially compensatory mechanism that has its function the overcoming of those disadvantages that are inherent in our body's lack of specializations. Because we have no tusks or claws, our intelligence is invoked in self-defense. And we devise and fabricate weapons. Lacking a pelt or hide, we must find or construct shelter or die. Again, we detect the circles of cause and effect interacting without beginning or end. A larger brain requires a larger cranium. The need for the larger cranium promotes more immature bodies. More immature bodies require more highly developed intelligence to defend and sustain them. And so, we are back at the beginning, again, needing a still larger brain to engender the necessary intelligence. There you have it. Humankind's intelligence is being brought into full use in all types of cultures, whether in the technologically oriented societies of the Western world we are familiar with, or in tribal societies, wherever they will survive. Technology is one external manifestation of the skills a highly developed brain confers upon its executive organs. The actual biological mechanisms of thinking are no different in an inhabitant of a tropical forest or in a scientist of a Western culture. The tribesman uses as much ingenuity to recognize and follow trails to hunt and to make all the decisions necessary to meet the requirements of existence in a so-called simple society, as does the engineer with the accumulated technical knowledge of countless generations at his disposal to construct the most complicated machines and computers and robotics. The external results are different, but the processes of the brain are the same. We see the most eloquent demonstration of this in the children of the most primitive tribes of, say, New Guinea or other places, who have been able to make the jump from a Stone Age world into one of familiarity with modern knowledge in one generation. What seems to us to be the long step from the earliest tools fashioned by our forerunners, those chipped stones and flakes that they used as hand axes and cutting instruments, is in fact one continuous line. Intelligence begins with the sensitivity of a single cell, and by a process of biological accumulation and selection transmitted genetically, reaches a current culmination in the complexity of the human brain. In the same way, the first chipped flint, by a process of cultural accumulation of knowledge passed on verbally and subjected to the selection of experience, reaches a current culmination in spacecraft, cyclotrons, and satellite-relayed television, for instance, and internet. At the same time, the natural and necessary playfulness of the young mammalian, as it explores its environment and learns how to live in it over time, and also by a cultural process of limitation, memory, and the transmission of knowledge and skills from generation to generation, reaches another apotheosis in the high cultures and great arts. For the comparatively weak creature who must cope with an environment and rise to any situation or perish, the resources of mental equipment are applied first to the most urgent exigencies. The earliest application of intelligence is devoted to devising tools as weapons, those that follow aid the amenities of life. Finally, religion, philosophy, and the arts make their appearance. The kind of tools that are made will depend on the material that happens to be available, be it leaves, branches, stones, clay, or the presence or absence of minerals. Thus, an interaction exists between environment and creature that affects the development of tools and culture, as well as of senses and intelligence. Yet, strangely enough, or perhaps not so. So surprisingly, in view of the basis uniformity of mankind, is cerebral mechanisms. No matter where, geographically, nor when, over the entire span of human history, local cultures have developed into advanced civilizations. We find that mankind's greatest thoughts as epitomized in the writings of philosophers show remarkable similarity. Some views on the nature and value of the knowledge, intellect, and intelligence propounded by wise men. We will come back to this and speak to you or me together again in a more appropriate time by the next episode. And we will then work out where our civilization is at the moment and where we are heading if it continues as it does currently. Keep smiling and be happy. Till we meet again.